I was alone after my husband's funeral, until my son's friend came to visit. The house was a tomb of silence, its air thick with the scent of lilies left over from the funeral. Margaret sat in her armchair, the one her husband, Thomas, had always claimed for his Sunday crosswords. The dim glow of a single lamp cast long shadows across the living room, where every corner held a memory, his reading glasses on the side table, the worn rug they'd argued over buying. Grief clung to her like damp cloth, heavy and unrelenting. At 62, Margaret had never imagined a world so empty. Her son, gone years ago in a car accident. Now Thomas, her anchor, taken by a heart that gave out too soon. The quiet wasn't just absence, it was a presence, pressing against her chest. She stared at the clock, 7:14 p.m., its ticks louder than they should be. No one had called or visited since the service that morning. The neighbors had sent cards, the church ladies casseroles, but none had lingered. Grief, Margaret realized, was a solitary sentence. She pulled her cardigan tighter, though the room wasn't cold, and let her eyes drift to the wedding photo on the mantel. Thomas's smile, wide and boyish even at 50, seemed to mock the hollow woman she'd become. A sharp knock at the door jolted her. Her heart stuttered, not from fear, but from the sheer surprise of sound. Who would come unannounced at this hour? She hesitated, smoothing her hair, suddenly aware of her tear-streaked face and wrinkled blouse. Another knock, softer but insistent, propelled her to her feet. She shuffled to the door, each step heavy with the weight of the day, and opened it to a figure bathed in the porch light's amber glow. Mrs. Harper, the voice was familiar, warm, but out of place. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair catching the light. His eyes, a striking hazel, held a quiet intensity. It took her a moment to place him, Daniel, her son Michael's best friend from high school. The boy who'd spent summers in their backyard, who'd cried at Michael's funeral. Now, he was no boy. 35, maybe, with a face that carried both youth and the faint lines of a life lived. Daniel, she said, her voice cracking from disuse. What are you doing here? He shifted, holding a foil-covered dish, his expression a mix of resolve and nervousness. I heard about Mr. Harper. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Harper. I didn't want you to be alone tonight. His words were simple, but they landed like a lifeline in the sea of her solitude. He lifted the dish slightly. Made you a casserole. Nothing fancy, just, thought you might need it. Margaret blinked, her throat tightening. The gesture was so small, so human, yet it pierced the fog of her grief. She stepped aside, gesturing weakly. Come in, please. As he crossed the threshold, the house felt less like a crypt. Daniel's presence, his quiet strength, the warmth in his eyes, brought a flicker of something she hadn't felt in days, connection. For the first time since Thomas's death, Margaret wasn't entirely alone. The casserole sat on the kitchen table, its foil cover glinting faintly under the fluorescent light. Margaret had insisted on making tea, more out of habit than necessity, her hands needing something to do. The kettle's soft whistle filled the awkward silence as she poured steaming water into two mismatched mugs, one Thomas's favorite, with a chipped handle, the other a souvenir from a long-ago trip to Maine. Daniel sat across from her, his large frame somehow fitting comfortably in the small, cluttered kitchen. His presence felt like an intrusion and a balm all at once. Thank you for the casserole, Margaret said, setting the mugs down. Her voice was steadier now, though it still carried the raw edge of someone unaccustomed to speaking. You didn't have to. Daniel shrugged, a small, easy gesture. My mom always said food's the best way to show up for someone. Figured she was onto something. His smile was gentle, not forced, and it coaxed the faintest curve from Margaret's lips, a reflex she hadn't expected. They sipped their tea, the conversation starting in fits and starts. Safe topics at first, the weather, unseasonably chilly, the neighborhood, quieter since the Wilsons moved, Daniel's job, he was a carpenter now, working on custom furniture. Margaret found herself listening more than speaking, surprised by how his voice, low, unhurried, filled the room without overwhelming it. He had a way of talking that didn't demand anything, didn't pry, but invited her to join if she wanted. Somewhere between the second sip of tea and a story about a botched bookshelf he'd built, Margaret's guard began to slip. "Thomas would have liked your work," she said, almost to herself. The words slipped out unbidden, and her chest tightened at the sound of her husband's name. She glanced at Daniel, expecting pity, but his eyes held only quiet attention. "Mr. Harper was always good with his hands," Daniel said, nodding. "Remember that birdhouse he built for Michael and me? Thing was a masterpiece. We were so proud to hang it in the oak tree out back." Margaret's breath caught. The memory was vivid, Thomas in his old flannel, sawdust in his hair, laughing as the boys painted the birdhouse a garish blue. "It's still there," she said softly. "The paint's faded, but it holds up." Her voice wavered, and she looked down at her tea, the steam blurring her vision. Daniel didn't rush to fill the silence. He leaned forward slightly, his hands wrapped around his mug. "He was a good man, Mrs. Harper. I know it's not the same, but I miss him too." The sincerity in his voice was a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of tears. "Margaret," she corrected, surprising herself. "You're not a kid anymore, Daniel. Call me Margaret." It was a small act of trust, a crack in the wall she'd built around her grief. He nodded, his gaze steady. Margaret, the way he said her name, careful, like it mattered, made her feel seen, not as the grieving widow, but as herself. She began to talk, haltingly at first, about Thomas. The way he'd hum off-key while cooking breakfast, his stubborn refusal to use a GPS, the quiet way he'd hold her hand during late-night walks. Each memory was a shard of glass, sharp yet precious, and Daniel listened without interruption, his nods and soft hums a steady rhythm beneath her words. "You don't have to hold it all in," he said at one point, when her voice broke recounting Thomas's last days. "Not with me. It's okay to let it out." His words weren't patronizing, just true, and they unlocked something in her, a permission to feel without shame. As the tea grew cold, Margaret realized she was no longer just surviving the moment. Daniel's patience, his willingness to sit with her pain, had carved out a space where grief could breathe. For the first time in days, she felt the weight of loss shift, not gone, but shared. And in that sharing, a flicker of warmth began to grow, not love, not yet, but the possibility of connection in a world that had felt so impossibly dark. The kitchen clock ticked past 9 p.m., its rhythm a quiet heartbeat in the room. The tea mug sat empty, pushed aside, and the casserole remained untouched, forgotten in the warmth of their conversation. Margaret's cheeks ached faintly, not from tears now, but from the unfamiliar stretch of smiles prompted by Daniel's stories. He'd been recounting a camping trip with Michael, one where they'd accidentally set their tent on fire trying to cook marshmallows. His laughter, low and infectious, had pulled her into the memory, and for a moment, the weight of grief felt lighter, like a shadow retreating from sunlight. They'd moved to the living room, settling on the couch, closer now than they'd been in the kitchen. The lamp's soft glow caught the edges of Daniel's face, highlighting the earnestness in his hazel eyes. Margaret noticed the way his hands moved when he spoke, strong and calloused from his carpentry work, yet gentle in their gestures. She hadn't noticed such things in years, not since Thomas, not since the world had still held color. Now, sitting here, she felt a stir of something unfamiliar, a quiet awareness of him as a man, not just Michael's friend or a kind visitor. "You've got a good heart, Daniel," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "Not many would spend their evening with an old widow like me." He turned to her, his expression shifting, serious but not heavy. "You're not just some widow, Margaret. You're you. Stronger than you know. And I'm here because I want to be." His words were steady, unguarded, and they landed with a weight that made her breath catch. No one had spoken to her like that in years, like she was more than her losses, more than the sum of her pain. Their eyes met, and the air between them thickened, charged with something unspoken. Margaret's heart thudded, a rhythm she hadn't felt in so long it startled her. Daniel leaned closer, hesitant, his gaze searching hers for permission, for a sign. She didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her head, drawn by a pull she couldn't name. When their lips met, it was tentative, soft, a question more than a statement. His mouth was warm, tasting faintly of tea, and for a moment, Margaret froze, caught between shock and a rush of longing. Then she kissed him back, her hand resting lightly on his cheek, the stubble rough under her fingers. It wasn't lust, not exactly, but a shared need, a mutual offering of comfort and presence. The kiss deepened, then broke, leaving them breathless, foreheads touching. "Margaret," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what this is, but it feels right," she nodded, unable to speak, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. They didn't rush. There was no urgency, only a quiet agreement as they stood, hands clasped, and moved to her bedroom. The act that followed was tender, deliberate, a dance of vulnerability rather than passion. Daniel's touch was careful, reverent, as if he understood the fragility of the moment. For Margaret, it was a reclamation, a rediscovery of her body as something capable of giving and receiving warmth. They held each other afterward, her head on his chest, his heartbeat a steady anchor in the dark. As dawn crept through the curtains, painting the room in soft grays, Margaret lay awake, Daniel's arm draped across her. The silence was different now, not oppressive, but peaceful. She felt the weight of her grief still, but it was no longer a monolith. In his embrace, she glimpsed a version of herself she'd thought lost, a woman who could feel, who could connect, who could live. The warmth of his body against hers was a quiet miracle, stitching together the frayed edges of her soul. For the first time since Thomas's death, Margaret felt not just alive, but whole. Morning light filtered through the bedroom curtains, casting a soft glow over the tangled sheets. Margaret lay still, Daniel's arm a warm weight across her waist, his steady breathing a quiet counterpoint to the storm brewing in her mind. The peace she'd felt hours ago, cradled in his embrace, was unraveling. Reality crept in like a cold draft, sharp, unyielding. What had they done? She was 62, a widow still raw with grief. He was 35, vibrant, with a life ahead of him. The memory of their night together, so tender in the dark, now felt reckless, exposed in the daylight. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and padded to the bathroom. In the mirror, her reflection was a stranger, gray streaks in her hair, lines etched around her eyes, a face that carried decades more than his. What did he see in her? A lonely woman, desperate for comfort? A mistake he'd regret when the world's judgment came knocking? The thought twisted in her gut. She splashed cold water on her face, but it did little to quiet the voices whispering of shame, of impropriety, of being too old to be wanted. Back in the bedroom, Daniel stirred, his eyes blinking open. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep, a soft smile breaking across his face. He propped himself on one elbow, the sheet slipping to reveal the strong lines of his shoulders. The sight of him, so at ease, so unguarded, made her heart ache with both longing and fear. "Morning," she echoed, her voice tight. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped in her lap, unable to meet his gaze. "Daniel, we need to talk about this." Last night, the words felt heavy, clumsy. "I don't know what I was thinking. You're so young, and I'm not. People will talk. They'll think I'm foolish, or worse, that you're taking advantage." Daniel's smile faded, replaced by a quiet intensity. He sat up, the space between them shrinking as he reached for her hand. His touch was warm, steady, but she flinched, her insecurities a wall she couldn't lower. "Margaret," he said, his voice low, deliberate. "Look at me." When she finally did, his eyes held no trace of doubt, only a fierce sincerity. "Last night wasn't a mistake. It wasn't pity or some impulse. I wanted to be with you because I see you, the woman who's been through hell and still has so much to give. I don't care what anyone else thinks." Her throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes. "But what if this is just temporary? You could have anyone, Daniel. Someone your age, someone who doesn't carry all this baggage. What if you wake up one day and realize I'm not enough?" He shook his head, his grip on her hand tightening. "You're not a placeholder, Margaret. You're not enough, you're more. And I'm not some kid chasing a fling." I've got my own scars, you know. He paused, his voice softening. After Michael died, I shut down for a long time. Felt like I didn't deserve to move on. Being here, with you, it's the first time I've felt like I'm not just existing. His words cracked something open in her, a floodgate of vulnerability. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I loved Thomas so much, and losing him broke me. I don't know if I can risk that kind of pain again. And I don't want to be your regret. Daniel leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers. I can't promise it'll be easy. But I can promise I'm here, right now, and I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me to. Let's figure this out together, okay? His honesty, raw and unguarded, was a lifeline. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek, which he brushed away with his thumb. They sat there, hands entwined, the morning light wrapping them in a fragile cocoon. Margaret's doubts didn't vanish, but they felt less suffocating, tempered by Daniel's reassurance and their shared openness. For the first time, she saw their connection not as a reckless leap, but as a bridge, built on trust, on mutual need, on the tentative hope that they could heal each other. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee, a small act of normalcy Margaret had insisted on after their morning talk. She and Daniel sat at the table, the casserole finally unwrapped and portioned onto plates, though neither had much appetite. The sunlight streaming through the window felt different now, less harsh, more like a promise. Margaret's hands wrapped around her mug, the warmth grounding her as she stole glances at Daniel. His presence, once a startling intrusion, now felt like a quiet anchor, steadying her against the uncertainties ahead. They hadn't spoken much since their raw exchange in the bedroom, but the silence was comfortable, filled with an unspoken agreement. Margaret knew the world outside wouldn't be kind, neighbors would whisper, friends might judge, and the age gap would raise eyebrows. But sitting here, with Daniel's steady gaze and the memory of his reassurance, those challenges felt less like walls and more like hurdles they could face together. What now? She asked, her voice soft but steady, testing the waters of their shared future. Daniel set his fork down, his expression thoughtful. We take it one day at a time, he said. I'm not saying it'll be easy, Margaret. People will talk, and we'll have moments where we doubt ourselves. But I want this, us. I want to see where it goes. His honesty, as always, was disarming, and she felt a flicker of courage in her chest, a spark she hadn't known she still possessed. She nodded, a small smile breaking through. I want that too, she admitted, the words a leap of faith. But I'm not used to this. Starting over. It feels like I'm betraying Thomas, even though I know he'd want me to live. Her voice wavered, but Daniel reached across the table, his hand covering hers. You're not betraying him, he said gently. You're honoring him by choosing to keep going. And I'm not here to replace him, Margaret. I'm just here to walk with you. His words settled over her like a balm, easing the guilt that had lingered like a shadow. Over the weeks that followed, their relationship grew, not as a flawless romance but as a partnership forged in shared vulnerability. They took walks in the park, ignoring the curious glances, and spent evenings in Margaret's living room, where Daniel's laughter filled spaces that had been silent too long. Margaret found herself painting again, a hobby she'd abandoned after Thomas's death, her brushstrokes bolder, infused with a newfound sense of possibility. Daniel, too, began to heal, his guilt over Michael's death softened by Margaret's quiet strength, her ability to listen without judgment. Their love wasn't perfect. There were moments of tension, Margaret's insecurities resurfacing, Daniel's occasional impatience with the world's scrutiny, but they faced them together, learning to lean into each other's flaws. It became clear that healing wasn't just for Margaret. Daniel, too, had been carrying wounds, and in her presence, he found a safe harbor to lay them down. One evening, months later, they stood on Margaret's porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Her hand rested in his, their fingers intertwined, and she felt a quiet certainty settle in her bones. Their relationship, born from the ashes of grief, had become a source of hope, a testament to the resilience of the human heart. They weren't broken souls anymore, but partners who had helped each other find life again. As the last light faded, Margaret leaned into Daniel's side, and they stepped into the uncertain future, not with fear, but with the strength of their shared journey.